A lot of my videos are very planned out and have all these points, and today I just want to chat with you and talk about perfectionism. Throughout my whole life, I've never identified myself as a perfectionist because I always felt like I was a little sloppy or rough around the edges. I remember even in grade school feeling like my handwriting wasn't perfect, and I feel like as a girl you were expected to have like this pristine, beautiful handwriting. I also remember often having like a messy desk and a messy room, and I just felt like I wasn't that person that had it all together and that was a perfectionist. I felt like perfectionist meant you had to be perfect. But gradually over time, I've realized how perfectionism has really affected my mood, how I feel about myself, and how I see the world. And I even look back to deciding to get a PhD in clinical psychology. Even at a very young age, I was working hard to make sure I had the right research background, the right positions. Looking back now with more time, I think I was living with a lot of perfectionism. But that was at the expense of my own self-fulfillment and happiness. I needed to break free from that and disappoint people, let people down, not live up to their expectations. I actually have a whole recent video about my story. I'll link that above and below in case you're interested. But ultimately, I've just had this realization that you might not feel like a perfectionist, but you might be a perfectionist. Or even if you're not a full-on perfectionist, there might be areas of your life where perfectionism breeds, where you're constantly putting yourself down, feeling like you're never good enough, when maybe you're doing just fine. And I think there are a few traits of this type of perfectionistic thinking that you can really look out for in yourself or be aware of. One is avoidance. Quite often, perfectionistic people are big avoiders. Because they have this all or nothing thinking, it's like, I need to do my absolute best and have no mistakes, or I need to do nothing. Quite often, they choose the latter. They choose to avoid and not engage with a situation where they might fail or present something that has imperfections in it. And I think that can be so limiting because then you keep yourself from engaging with the things that give you joy or meaning. And I have noticed that in myself, even in everyday around the house type tasks. Like recently I was making pasta and I was originally just going to make something super basic, like maybe just pasta with sauce or something like pre-made sauce. But then as the pasta started cooking, I thought, well, let me cut up some garlic and saute some of that. Let me throw in some veggies and saute those. Let me combine a bunch of other ingredients and make my own sauce. And it started out as a simple task, but I ended up building it into something far more complicated and something that required a lot more energy, both because then I had to mix all the ingredients, but then I had more to clean up, and it just turned into a way bigger thing than it needed to be. And at the time, my husband Andy was like, Aylin, you just can't do things halfway, can you? And I was like, oh my goodness, I can't. But that can translate to so many other areas of my life. Like what's lost there? Maybe a little extra energy or time. But in a bigger sense, for bigger things in my life, if I feel like I can't do them halfway, then they can take so much more effort. And I even see that happening sometimes on my YouTube channel, where I feel like I need to have a thoughtfully planned out, not script because I don't script things, but like a very specific plan for what I want to say and what I want to communicate. And sometimes that's good. Like if I didn't prepare at all, I might be really disorganized, possibly like this video today. But sometimes there's beauty in the lack of preparation, and there's beauty in the moment, and especially for something like a YouTube video where it's just a casual, chatty thing. And maybe I need to calm down a little bit. That's almost why I wanted to make this video. I didn't really have anything planned for this video. I just kind of sat down and started talking, but I want to challenge myself to use this space as an exercise to make mistakes and to do things halfway and not to do them all the way. Because sometimes I think I feel like a failure if I don't do them all the way or if I don't do my very best every single time. So I think that's another trait of perfectionist type people, that it's like all or nothing. And so I want to try to do things halfway. And that reminds me of the work I used to do with giving therapy to people with OCD. And while OCD is a very specific illness that might overlap at times with perfectionism, but is a different thing, I do think there's something to be learned from how one treats OCD and apply that to some principles with perfectionism. So basically, OCD is this thing where you have obsessions and compulsions. Obsessions are these ideas that pop into your head that really bother you. Often it's sort of a what if statement, like, what if I fail at this? What if I get sick? What if my family member gets sick? And then compulsions are things we do either mentally or behaviorally to try to quell those obsessions or kind of reduce how much they stress us out. For example, in the case of the stereotypical OCD case where someone's afraid of getting sick and so they wash their hands all the time. That's an example. But what I think people misunderstand about OCD is that OCD can look very different. A lot of people with OCD don't care about excessive hand washing at all. It can be related to a range of different obsessions or concerns, and so it can look very different. Anyway, one evidence-based treatment for OCD is exposure therapy, and more specifically, exposure and response prevention. So you expose them to a situation and you don't engage in the compulsion. So for example, maybe you get your hands a little bit dirty and then you don't wash them. Or at least you don't wash them as thoroughly as you normally do. And some people I treated with OCD would struggle with perfectionism around looking good to their bosses or being afraid that people would think they were a failure at work. And so we would work around actually purposely building little tiny mistakes, harmless mistakes, but mistakes nonetheless, into their emails that they would send a boss or person of authority. And they'd have to sit with the discomfort of knowing that they had a typo or some kind of little mistake in that email and just live with that doubt, live with that anxiety. And I think a similar concept can be applied to perfectionism. First of all, the idea that you might not be a perfectionist across the board. People are complicated, and often perfectionists have specific things they're perfectionistic about, but it might not be that they're perfect in all areas of their life. And then secondly, maybe it's possible to use some of these exposure principles in our lives if we're experiencing some perfectionism. So purposefully making little mistakes or purposefully doing things halfway so that you realize, oh, it's okay to sometimes do things halfway. Like, the world doesn't end, my life goes on, and maybe I don't need to be so afraid of a little bit of failure. Because I think that's another trait that you often see in people with perfectionism, a fear of failure, a fear of any kind of failure, even a little failure. And I'm just guessing that for all of us, there are areas of our lives where we are being perfectionistic, but don't really realize it. And sometimes it's even the areas that we might be failing most in. Like, it might be things that we're avoiding or just not putting our full effort into because we're so afraid of taking the risk on ourselves and then failing. Sometimes the area we're being perfectionistic in is maybe the area where we're doing the worst, which feels counterintuitive, but I think it's true. I guess I'm just making this video for myself to kind of ponder some of these things and to challenge myself to try to lean into a few mistakes and to not feel like I need to fix everything all the time. And maybe just to help you too, if this is something you find yourself struggling with. Maybe this can serve just as a reminder to take a second and to be okay with doing things halfway, or to approach the things that you've been avoiding and take a risk on yourself. Maybe embracing failure, leaning into the idea of failure. Because I can tell you, when I decided to switch careers to move to something more creative after I got my PhD and I felt like there was only one path for me, when I blew that all up and sort of started over and I failed, I was also so freed, and I was able to expand my life in new, exciting ways that I did not anticipate. And so now that I'm also looking at perfectionism in my day-to-day, I want to challenge myself to think about, how can I take risks on myself? How can I embrace failure? Because, for example, going back to the cooking, quite often I'll order in and I'll avoid cooking because I feel like it's this big chore that I have to make this amazing meal every time I cook. But then I end up spending more money than if I had just cooked in the first place. So my point is that if I just were willing to make more mediocre meals for myself, maybe I'd actually save money in the long run. And maybe also those meals, even if they're a little haphazard, would be healthier than takeout or delivery or something like that. So that's a little example, but I want to lean into that in my YouTube channel, in my work, in my relationships with people. I want to learn to be a little bit more okay at being mediocre. Because believe me, I do things in a mediocre way. It's not like what I do all the time is perfect. It's just sometimes I feel like I can't go for things, or I end up doing things in a way that are actually worse for me because I'm stopped by that fear that I might fail. I think another area of life where I've really had to reckon with some of my perfectionistic traits is getting my MS diagnosis. And after a big flare I had that led to my diagnosis, I've noticed some changes in me. I've noticed cognitively, sometimes I'm a little slower, or sometimes I struggle to find words as quickly as I usually do, or I struggle even more with remembering people's names. I'm just so much more limited physically, and I'm dizzy so much of the time that it's sometimes hard to get things done the way I'd like to. And so I've really struggled with reckoning with the idea that I have these things that impact my ability to function, at least in the way that I used to. And it's a daily thing for me, and it's forced me to see myself differently and to accept this new version of me. It's been pretty painful, but I also think it's opened my mind to the idea that different people can have different abilities or challenges that they're facing, but everybody has something to offer. And just because sometimes I struggle to find words or feel a bit dizzy doesn't mean that I don't still have something to bring to the table. And maybe even some of these changes allow me to see the world in a new and different way that actually gives me more knowledge or awareness of certain things, maybe more empathy in certain ways. And so I'm working really hard to not see my challenges as imperfections as much as just another aspect of me that I offer the world. And maybe there are kind of negative aspects to that, but maybe there are also positive aspects to that. And I'm still in that process, but I'm just working on seeing things differently and seeing some of my, quote, flaws as strengths, or at least something that makes me individual in kind of a cool way. Anyway, I guess those are just some thoughts on my mind. I'm trying to play around with having more videos that are just thoughts on my mind as opposed to fully planned videos. And I'd love to know what you think about this style of video. And if any of you have experiences with perfectionism or are coming to the same realization as me, like I used to think of myself as totally not perfectionistic, but I'm seeing that, maybe there are glimmers of perfectionism in me. Let me know that too. Thank you so much for spending this little bit of time with me, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye.